The Wolf's Lair, known in German as Wolfsschanze, was Adolf Hitler's primary military headquarters on the Eastern Front during World War II. Hidden deep in the forests of East Prussia, this massive complex of bunkers, buildings, and fortifications was where Hitler spent more than 800 days directing Germany's war effort, particularly the campaign against the Soviet Union. It was the site of the famous July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt by Claus von Stauffenberg that nearly killed Hitler, and that led to the execution of thousands of suspected conspirators. The Wolf's Lair was a fortress of concrete and steel, a command center from which some of history's most consequential and terrible decisions were made, and a symbol of Nazi Germany's military ambitions and ultimately its catastrophic defeat. When World War II ended in May 1945, what happened to this infamous complex? Was it destroyed or preserved? Did it become a memorial, a tourist site, or simply an abandoned ruin? How has it been used and interpreted in the decades since the war? Today, we'll trace the history of the Wolf's Lair, from its construction through its abandonment by the Germans in January 1945, its occupation by Soviet forces, its existence during the Cold War when it was in a restricted Soviet military zone, and its transformation in recent decades into a historical site visited by tourists while remaining a controversial and problematic memorial. This is a story about how we deal with the physical remains of evil regimes, about the challenges of preserving sites associated with terrible crimes while not glorifying them, and about how a place can be simultaneously a historical artifact, a tourist attraction, and a troubling reminder of humanity's capacity for organized violence and destruction. The Wolf's Lair was constructed beginning in 1940 in anticipation of Operation Barbarossa, Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union that would begin in June 1941. The site was chosen because of its location in a remote forested area near the small town of Rastenburg, now Kentschin in northeastern Poland, but then part of East Prussia in eastern Germany. The location was selected for several strategic reasons. It was relatively close to the Eastern Front, where Germany would be fighting the Soviet Union, allowing Hitler to be near the action and to exercise direct command over military operations. It was in a remote area that would be difficult for enemy forces to locate and attack. The surrounding forests provided natural camouflage, and the complex was further concealed with camouflage netting and artificial trees. The area had good rail connections, important for bringing in supplies, and for Hitler's travel by his armored train. The climate was harsh with cold winters, and the site was plagued by mosquitoes in summer. But these inconveniences were considered acceptable given the strategic advantages. The construction of the Wolf's Lair was a massive undertaking involving thousands of workers and enormous quantities of concrete, steel, and other materials. The complex eventually consisted of more than 80 buildings and bunkers spread over an area of about 250 hectares, or 625 acres. The buildings included Hitler's personal bunker, which was heavily reinforced with walls of concrete several meters thick, bunkers for other Nazi leaders, including Hermann Göring, Wilhelm Keitel, and Alfred Jodl, buildings for military staff and communications, a casino for officers, a cinema, power stations, water treatment facilities, barracks for guards, and numerous other structures needed to support the military headquarters. The complex was divided into 3 security zones, with increasingly strict access controls as one approached the center, where Hitler's bunker was located. The entire area was surrounded by minefields, barbed wire, and guard posts, and anti-aircraft batteries were positioned to defend against air attack. Hitler first arrived at the Wolf's Lair on June 24, 1941, 3 days after the invasion of the Soviet Union began, and he would spend much of the next 3.5 years there. The Wolf's Lair became the command center for the Eastern Front, the place where Hitler and his military staff planned operations, where they received reports from the battlefield, where they made strategic and tactical decisions, and where they directed the vast military campaign that would ultimately kill tens of millions of people. Hitler's daily routine at the Wolf's Lair was similar to his routine elsewhere, with late waking, military briefings in the afternoon and evening, lengthy dinners with his staff, and late-night conversations that stretched into the early morning hours. The atmosphere at the Wolf's Lair was tense and oppressive, with Hitler increasingly isolated from reality, making disastrous decisions, refusing to accept bad news, and blaming his generals for failures while taking credit for any successes. The most famous event that occurred at the Wolf's Lair was the assassination attempt on July 20th, 1944. Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg, a German army officer who had become convinced that Hitler needed to be removed to save Germany from total destruction, brought a bomb in a briefcase to a military briefing at the Wolf's Lair. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase containing the bomb under the heavy oak conference table near where Hitler was standing, then excused himself from the meeting, claiming he needed to make a phone call. The bomb exploded, destroying the conference room and killing 4 people, but Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries. The conference had been moved from Hitler's underground bunker to a wooden building because it was a hot summer day and the bunker was stuffy, and this change of location saved Hitler's life as the wooden building's windows blew out, dissipating much of the blast, whereas an explosion in the confined concrete bunker would have killed everyone present. Additionally, someone had moved Stauffenberg's briefcase to the other side of the heavy table support, placing the thick wooden table between Hitler and the bomb. These accidents of circumstance allowed Hitler to survive, and the assassination attempt's failure led to a massive purge of suspected conspirators, with thousands executed, including many of Germany's most capable officers. By January 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into East Prussia and approached the Wolf's Lair's location, the decision was made to abandon the complex. Hitler had already left in November 1944, departing the Wolf's Lair for the last time and traveling to Berlin, where he would spend his final months in the Führerbunker. As German forces prepared to retreat from the area, they received orders to destroy the Wolf's Lair to prevent it from falling intact into Soviet hands. German engineers planted explosives in many of the bunkers and buildings and detonated them over several days in late January 1945. The explosions severely damaged many structures, collapsing roofs, blowing out walls, and creating the ruins that visitors see today. However, the bunkers were so massively constructed with such thick concrete that even dedicated demolition efforts could not completely destroy them. The explosions broke apart the structures and made them unusable, but they left substantial ruins rather than completely obliterating the complex. The Germans' inability to fully destroy the Wolf's Lair despite their demolition efforts demonstrates the extraordinary strength of the construction and the massive amounts of material that had been used to build it. Soviet forces captured the Wolf's Lair area in late January 1945 as they swept across East Prussia in their advance toward Germany proper. The Soviets found a devastated complex of damaged bunkers and destroyed buildings. They conducted investigations of the site, examining the ruins, photographing the damage, and gathering intelligence about how the complex had functioned. The Soviets were particularly interested in Hitler's personal bunker and in understanding the headquarters' operations, as this information was useful for their intelligence services. However, the Wolf's Lair had no strategic value to the Soviets at this point in the war, as the fighting had moved westward and the remote forest location was no longer relevant to military operations. The site was in what would become Soviet-controlled territory after the war, as East Prussia was divided between the Soviet Union and Poland, with the Wolf's Lair area becoming part of Poland. After the war ended in May 1945, the Wolf's Lair entered a period of neglect and obscurity that would last for decades. The area around the Wolf's Lair became part of Poland as borders were redrawn, with the town of Rastenburg being renamed Kentschen, and the German population being expelled and replaced with Polish settlers. The Wolf's Lair itself was in a restricted military zone controlled by the Soviet Army, which maintained a presence in Poland as part of the Warsaw Pact throughout the Cold War. For several decades, the ruins were off-limits to civilians, guarded by Soviet soldiers, and largely forgotten, except by military historians and by locals who knew of the site's existence. The Soviets used some of the less damaged buildings for storage and possibly for training purposes, but they did not attempt to rebuild or restore the complex, allowing the ruins to deteriorate further from weather, vegetation growth, and time. During the Cold War decades, from 1945 to 1989, very few people visited the Wolf's Lair. It was not publicized, it was not accessible to tourists, and it existed in a kind of limbo as a destroyed Nazi site in Soviet-controlled territory. Some historical researchers and journalists managed to gain access to document the ruins, and occasional articles or books mentioned the Wolf's Lair, but it remained obscure to the general public. The Polish authorities and the Soviet military apparently had no interest in preserving or promoting the site, preferring to let it remain a forgotten ruin. This neglect was understandable given the site's association with Nazi Germany and with Hitler personally, as there was no desire to create a shrine or memorial that might attract neo-Nazis or that might glorify the Nazi regime. However, this neglect also meant that the historical value of the site was not being utilized for education, and the physical remains were deteriorating without protection or conservation efforts. The situation began to change in the late 1980s as the Cold War ended and as the Soviet Union's control over Eastern Europe weakened. Poland underwent political transformation with the Solidarity movement and the eventual end of communist rule in 1989. As Poland became independent and democratic, attitudes toward historical sites, including difficult heritage associated with World War II, began to shift. The Soviet military withdrew from Poland in the early 1990s, and the Wolf's Lair ceased to be a restricted military zone. For the first time since the war, the site became accessible, and questions arose about what should be done with it. Should it be preserved as a historical monument? Should it be allowed to continue deteriorating? Should it be completely demolished to erase a symbol of Nazi terror? Should it be developed as a tourist site? These questions reflected broader debates about how to deal with Nazi-era structures and sites, debates that have occurred throughout Europe as societies grapple with their World War II heritage. In the 1990s, the decision was made to preserve the Wolf's Lair ruins and to open them to visitors as a historical site. This decision was controversial and remains debated. Those who supported preservation and public access argued that the site has important historical and educational value, that it allows people to see the physical reality of Hitler's headquarters and to understand the scale and nature of Nazi Germany's military operations, that it can serve as a place to reflect on the war and its consequences, and that destroying or hiding the site would be a form of denying history. Those who opposed making the Wolf's Lair a tourist site argued that it risks becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis and Hitler admirers, that tourism trivializes the terrible events associated with the place, that it potentially glorifies Hitler and the Nazi regime, and that the site should have been completely destroyed, or at least left as an unmarked ruin rather than being promoted as an attraction. Despite these concerns, the Wolf's Lair was open to tourists in the 1990s, with the ruins being made accessible via pathways, with informational signs being erected, with guides being trained to lead tours, and with visitor facilities including a parking area, a ticket office, a restaurant, and a hotel being developed. The site is now operated as a museum and tourist attraction, receiving tens of thousands of visitors annually from Poland and from around the world. The experience of visiting the Wolf's Lair today provides insights into both the historical reality of the site and the contemporary questions about how we memorialize and interpret difficult history. Visitors to the Wolf's Lair today enter through a parking area and ticket office located outside the original security perimeter. After purchasing tickets, visitors can explore the ruins either independently or as part of guided tours that are offered in multiple languages. The site is large, covering a significant area of forest, and visitors can easily spend several hours walking through the ruins and reading the informational materials. The pathways lead through the forest, connecting the various bunkers and building remains. And informational signs provide context about what each structure was and how it was used. The ruins themselves are impressive and disturbing. Massive broken concrete structures overgrown with vegetation, testament to the enormous construction effort and to the violence of the demolition. Hitler's personal bunker is one of the focal points of visits. The structure is severely damaged from the German demolition efforts, with its roof collapsed and its walls broken, but the massive thickness of the concrete walls is still evident, with some walls being 6 or 7 meters thick. Visitors can walk around and partially into the ruins, seeing the scale of the construction and imagining what it was like when the bunker was functional. Informational signs describe Hitler's daily routine at the Wolf's Lair, the bunker's construction, and the events that occurred there. Other significant structures include the bunker, where the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt occurred, which is actually the remains of the conference barracks rather than a bunker, though often referred to as such. The site of the explosion is marked, and the story of Stauffenberg's attempt and Hitler's survival is explained in detail. Visitors also see the ruins of bunkers used by other Nazi leaders, including Göring, Keitel, and Jodl, the remains of the communication center, various building foundations, and the extensive defensive installations, including gun emplacements and observation posts. The presentation and interpretation of the Wolf's Lair as a tourist site has been criticized from multiple perspectives. Some historians and educators argue that the site's interpretation does not sufficiently emphasize the criminal nature of the Nazi regime and the terrible consequences of the decisions made at the Wolf's Lair. The informational materials tend to focus on technical and military aspects, describing the construction, the daily routines, the assassination attempt, and similar factual matters, but provide less context about the Holocaust, about the brutality of the Eastern Front, about the millions who died as a result of decisions made at this location, or about the moral implications of the Nazi regime. Critics argue that this relatively neutral and factual presentation risks normalizing or even romanticizing the Nazi war effort, focusing on Hitler and the military operations without adequately confronting the evil that was being perpetrated. Another criticism is that the site can attract neo-Nazis and Hitler admirers who come to pay homage to Hitler rather than to learn history. The site operators have struggled with how to prevent the Wolf's Lair from becoming a pilgrimage destination for extremists. There have been reports of visitors making Nazi salutes, leaving flowers or other tributes, and generally treating the site reverently rather than critically. The site has banned Nazi symbols and gestures, and guards watch for inappropriate behavior. But controlling how visitors think about and respond to the site is impossible. The very existence of Hitler's bunker, even in ruins, creates a material connection to Hitler that some people find attractive for wrong reasons. This problem is not unique to the Wolf's Lair, but affects many Nazi-era sites, and there are no easy solutions to preventing misuse while maintaining historical access. On the other hand, supporters of the Wolf's Lair as a museum and educational site argue that it serves important purposes. Students and tourists can see the physical scale of Nazi Germany's military apparatus, can understand the realities of Hitler's life during the war, can learn about the assassination attempt and resistance to Hitler, and can reflect on the war in a place where it was actually directed. The ruins themselves, massive broken concrete structures slowly being reclaimed by nature, can be seen as monuments to the defeat of Nazism and to the futility of Hitler's ambitions. Unlike restored sites that might glorify the past, the Wolf's Lair's state of destruction and abandonment can be interpreted as appropriate, given the regime's ultimate failure and criminality. The site provides opportunities for education about World War II, about the nature of dictatorship, about military history, and about the importance of resistance, opportunities that would be lost if the site were destroyed or remained inaccessible. The Wolf's Lair's status and use have continued to evolve in recent years. The site has become a more professional operation with improved interpretation, better facilities, and more sophisticated educational programming. Exhibitions have been added that provide historical context beyond just the technical details of the headquarters. The site hosts educational programs for school groups, though the quality and content of these programs vary. There have been ongoing discussions about how to further develop the site to maximize its educational value while minimizing risks of glorification or trivialization. Some proposals have suggested creating a more comprehensive documentation center that would place the Wolf's Lair in the broader context of World War II, the Holocaust, and Nazi crimes. Others have proposed more emphasis on the stories of victims and on the consequences of the decisions made at the site, rather than focusing primarily on Hitler and the military operations. These discussions reflect broader debates in Germany, Poland, and other countries about how to memorialize and interpret difficult heritage from the World War II era. The physical condition of the Wolf's Lair ruins has also been a subject of attention. The structures continue to deteriorate from weather exposure, vegetation growth, and the effects of time on damaged concrete. There have been debates about whether and how much to preserve the ruins. Some conservation efforts have been undertaken to stabilize particularly endangered structures and to prevent further collapse that might endanger visitors. However, there is also an argument that allowing the ruins to deteriorate naturally is appropriate, allowing nature to reclaim the site and eventually erasing the physical traces of Nazi presence. This reflects a philosophical question about whether preserving such sites in perpetuity is desirable or whether there is value in allowing them to eventually disappear. For now, the approach has been selective preservation to maintain safety and to keep the site accessible while not attempting full restoration or preventing natural deterioration of structures that are not dangerous. The Wolf's Lair has appeared in various cultural contexts since the war, contributing to its continued presence in public consciousness. It has been featured in numerous documentaries, historical books, and films about Hitler and World War II. The assassination attempt of July 20th, 1944, has been the subject of multiple films, including the 2008 film Valkyrie starring Tom Cruise, which brought renewed attention to the site and to the story of the resistance to Hitler. Such cultural representations contribute to public knowledge about the Wolf's Lair, but also raise questions about how such sites should be represented in popular culture, with concerns that entertainment media might romanticize or sensationalize rather than educate. The local economy around the Wolf's Lair has been affected by its status as a tourist attraction. The area around Kenshin is relatively rural and economically modest, and tourism related to the Wolf's Lair provides employment and income for local businesses, including hotels, restaurants, tour operators, and souvenir shops. This economic dimension creates another layer of complexity in debates about the site, as there are practical economic interests in maintaining and promoting the Wolf's Lair as a tourist destination, interests that can conflict with concerns about appropriate memorialization and interpretation. The sale of Wolf's Lair-related souvenirs, including books, postcards, and replica Nazi items, has been particularly controversial, with critics arguing that commercializing a site associated with such terrible crimes is inappropriate and disrespectful to victims. Comparing the Wolf's Lair to other Nazi sites provides useful context for understanding the different approaches to preserving and interpreting such difficult heritage. In Germany, various Nazi-era buildings and sites have been preserved with varying approaches. Some, like the Nuremberg Rally Grounds, have been partially preserved with documentation centers that provide critical historical context. Others, like Hitler's Munich residence, have been deliberately demolished or repurposed to prevent them from becoming pilgrimage sites. The site of Hitler's Berghof, his mountain retreat that was destroyed by bombing and then by German authorities after the war, remains a highly controversial site where there is no reconstruction and where interpretation has been minimal, partly to discourage neo-Nazi tourism. Concentration camps, including Auschwitz, Dachau, and others, have been preserved as memorials and museums, with extensive interpretation focused on victims and on the crimes committed. serving primarily educational and commemorative purposes rather than focusing on the perpetrators. The Wolf's Lair's status is somewhat between these approaches, preserved but not fully reconstructed, interpreted but perhaps not with sufficient emphasis on victims and crimes, accessible but controversial. The question of whether sites like the Wolf's Lair should exist at all continues to be debated. Some argue for complete destruction of all Nazi sites to prevent any possibility of glorification and to erase physical symbols of the regime. Others argue that preservation is essential for historical understanding and education, that destroying sites would be a form of historical denial, and that properly interpreted sites can serve important educational and moral purposes. There is no consensus, and different countries and communities have made different decisions based on their particular circumstances and values. The Wolf's Lair's current status as a partially preserved ruin, open to tourism, represents one approach, but it remains contentious and subject to ongoing debate and potential changes. Recent developments have included increased attention to improving the Wolf's Lair's educational content and historical interpretation. There have been efforts to add more information about the victims of Nazi policies, about the brutality of the Eastern Front, about the Holocaust, and about the moral dimensions of the Nazi regime, moving beyond the earlier focus on technical and military details. Educational programs for school groups have been enhanced to ensure students understand not just what happened at the Wolf's Lair, but also the broader historical and moral context. These improvements respond to earlier criticisms and reflect a maturing approach to interpreting difficult heritage sites. The Wolf's Lair has also been a site of various commemorative events over the years, including ceremonies marking the anniversary of the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt. These ceremonies, often attended by German officials and by descendants of the resistance members who were executed after the attempt failed, serve to honor those who opposed Hitler and to commemorate their courage. Such events help to frame the Wolf's Lair not just as Hitler's headquarters, but also as a site of resistance, adding a more positive dimension to its historical significance. However, the site remains primarily associated with Hitler and the Nazi war effort rather than with resistance, and this association continues to make it controversial.